Welcome back to Chasing Squirrels. This is episode 64, and I get to sit with Alicia Pascual today. So just so other people can get to know you a little bit, could you throw down an introduction for yourself?
Sure. So I'm Alicia Pascual. I am an English teacher at Markham District High School with the York Region District School Board. In September, I'll actually be starting a new role as the assistant head for the English department at my school. And I'm just excited to have an opportunity to sit down and chat with you. I do apologize that it's taken some time. When you first reached out about sitting down like this in particular, I said I needed a little bit more time because we were still at the beginning and the building stages of our project, and I needed to be in deeper with it to be able to really speak to it and to be able to reflect on it in what I thought or hoped would be a meaningful way. So thanks for being patient with me.
Yeah, it's not a problem at all. I have colleagues that do podcasts, and they're on the weekly. They're on the weekly, and there's ways to get to the conversations that fast. I had one person I spoke to. Her name's Jen Apgar, and she's out of Guelph, and I think the equivalent would be like a tech coach for their school board. And I ended up having to meet with her twice because in the front end of the conversation, she flipped it and she said, "So why are you doing podcasting?"
Right.
And I didn't have that on, you have the question kind of like sketch note in front of you there. Like that wasn't on my plan. And it gave me that pause. I was like, why am I doing this? And it's funny to have a conversation. Like I had the conversation a little bit with myself, but I'd never pushed it outside my own head. It was very much just a professional pursuit. How do I understand more about school in a wider context? How far can I go? And I managed to have a conversation with another teacher in Australia. And when you're having professional discussions that far away, I don't know, I had a sudden sense of distance. And so coming back to like across the table live kind of conversations, I'm hoping that moving forward with the podcast, this is the new format. To be able to sit down, coffee shop, Starbucks, no sponsorship there, not looking for any money. Yeah, motorcycles in the background. But this, I mentioned, this becomes part of the tone of the conversation, and it humanizes the digital. So, how about this? Just on the front end, what's your origin story for teaching? So you coming into education, how did you notice that you had a teacher side?
I think that there's something really special about teachers. I think that for a lot of teachers, they're born that way.
Okay.
And I guess we can't say that's true for everybody and everything, but for myself anyway, that's the case. And I always knew that I wanted to be a teacher. I remember being 6 years old and lining up all of my stuffed animals and teaching to them and reading them stories. And honestly, I can't imagine anything else that I would want to be doing. And I don't think I ever imagined anything else I wanted to be doing. And I think I'm really fortunate because for me, I know that a large part of that had to do with the educators that I came into contact with when I was in school. And so they love their jobs and they seem to do it so well. And I thought this is what I want to do too.
I had someone else mention, they told a story on one of the episodes where, and this was related to them after the fact. So they don't have a memory of this, but in much the same origin story, they were told that when they were younger, they lined up their stuffies, their stuffed animals, and they would just yell at them. But the story goes on, and then that's where one parent turned to the other parent and said, "He's going to be a teacher."
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, so that's the story that just brought to mind the line, and it's funny because it also sparks up. I have that. I can't tell you how many pictures I have of my kids with their toys lined up, and it might be a tea party, a games night, but they have them all set up, and I have several of these photos of, in different contexts of my children kind of standing there. I guess I could see it as standing, commanding the class in front of the class. I will say my daughter is the one that's quicker to sort of say, "No, we're going to do it like this." So
Be careful, because I've heard the statistics for children of teachers becoming teachers are very high. So
it's funny you should say that, because there was no plan for me to ever be a teacher.
right.
I was very much, the school was a necessary distraction to what I consider real work, which was working in restaurants. I mentioned, on our on-ramp, just that idea that I got a job because my parents wouldn't buy me the stuff I wanted. And then I stuck with the job working in restaurants because the money was decent and there was a lot of work there. So there was no plan for me to ever become a teacher. And I would even argue some of the behaviors that I threw down in high school. It's funny, the behaviors that I threw down in high school completely informed me in being a teacher right now.
Me too.
But if you were to ever sort of, no one would have ever said, as I was kicking a desk across the floor, or, riding the wheelie chairs down the hall out of class, having races, like, hey, there's teacher material. Nothing like that.
But I think that's what makes some teachers phenomenal teachers, right?
Well, I think let's put it in that space of you got to bring your whole self to it.
Right.
Because I will tell you, hands down, me now telling story, like I have a lot of connectivity with students now because I'm a story-based teacher. So I bring some of those stories, and I can't tell you how many times there's a moment in class where I'm like, why does that look familiar? I'm like, oh my gosh, I did the same thing back in high school. And right away it like defangs your energy. You're like, okay, I can speak to this.
Right.
I don't have to speak about it. I can actually speak to it.
I've had similar experiences as a parent.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. Yeah, you got to blame yourself when you're looking at your kids to a degree.
Yeah.
You mentioned mentorship and great teachers. So, what would be some shout outs then? So, who could you sort of put into that mix? That I don't believe teachers have to be the formal ones that we meet in the classroom. For myself, one of the most amazing teachers that I've ever had is Maria, and she was the aunt of the chef that I did my apprenticeship with. But I learned everything from Maria. Maybe 4'10", maybe, God, at the time I would have said she was probably like 80, but I still believe she's 80 to this day.
Right.
But such a force, so intense, so passionate, so connected with the heritage of the curriculum she was teaching me, that she'll forever be in my head as one of the best teachers for me when I was doing my chef's apprenticeship.
So do you mean mentor teachers when I was in school personally, or teachers like colleagues?
The list is big, eh?
It's really big, and so it's funny because on the website for YFR, which I guess we'll talk about, I have a gratitude page, and the list of people on that page keeps growing and growing and growing. Yeah. Because as teachers, really, truly, and honestly, the best resource we have is each other. And I am so inspired by the work that so many teachers are doing, and just the spirit of collaboration that really seems to be growing exponentially in our board. So in terms of like teacher shout outs, I would have to say that for this particular path in general, with this YFR project, it really began with yourself and with a phenomenal history head at Stephen Lewis Secondary School named Julie Bolton. And you guys sort of planted those seeds to show me that we can really start to embrace creativity and challenge what we see as being what's important in our classrooms and in the curriculum that we're teaching, and to really just embrace the spirit of trying something new. And another mentor sort of that helps really ground all of this would be Deb Grant, who was also an alt ed head in our board, now retired, but her and Mary Lawless really helped me very early in my career understand the importance of putting the students first. And so the curriculum, of course, is absolutely important, but first and foremost is meeting the needs of the students in front of you. And two other people that really helped sort of round all of this out would be Sanji, who is the English curriculum consultant for our board, and Pam Agua. And those two individuals really helped me figure out how to do what I wanted to do, these big ideas that I had, on the ground level, like in the classroom, and have it all meet what it is that I needed to do to service the students that were in front of me.
You make me, it sort of brings to mind that idea of mentors, so when I did my apprenticeship, I had no choice. I sort of was put, my chef's name was Johnny. He's like, you're working with my aunt. I'm
Right.
like, oh, okay. And you kind of go there and you don't know, I don't think he really had any clue about what I needed as a young cook, but that was just the process. You're going to work with Maria. And it was sort of like an on-ramp to this restaurant. It ended up being the longer term relationship. It was interesting. So I'm signed up to him, but I'm doing all my learning through her. And when I wrote my papers, it was sort of, I was fortunate that he had his chef papers, which meant I can write my test and get my papers, but all of my learning that supported not the test, but the next steps that I couldn't see yet were because of Maria.
Right.
So, the mentors that you're sometimes forced to work with are also as important as some of the incidentals that kind of pop along the way. From whether from that list or just maybe a different category altogether. What about accidental mentors? Some that you just like, I didn't even know that I needed you or I needed that until you kind of brought me. We talked on the on-ramp about those moments where you don't have gravity. Right? And you're reaching out with the best stuff and someone just kind of goes, I gotcha. Here, come over here for a sec.
Right.
What about that?
So, accidental mentors. The first one that pops into my head is the parent of a former student.
Okay.
And a couple of years ago, I had this student in my English classroom, grade 9, academic English, and we were teaching a mythology unit that all of the teachers were expected to teach in their course. And one of my students I didn't realize was Indigenous. And so the assignment for this mythology unit, the summative assignment, was that students had to research a cultural myth and then share it with the rest of the class. And I mean, there was more to it than that, but that's basically the gist of it. And so I had this phenomenal parent named Darren Douglas who sent me this very lovely email and basically said, I appreciate what you're trying to do here. I like that you are attempting to be inclusive, right? And I like that this unit will expose students to a variety of different cultural beliefs. But I need you to realize that my son is likely going to tell the story of Sky Woman. And this is a story that is incredibly important to my people. And that when he is presenting the story, when you're talking about the story, you do not refer to it as a myth. And that sort of really set a light bulb off in my head. And I reached out to this parent, and we've since become very good friends. And that is the moment where I really started to understand where we're trying to get in our board right now in terms of equity and inclusivity, because that was the moment when I really began to unpack a lot of the colonial beliefs that we hold, right? And how that transfers into our classroom and how that results in what books are available in our book room and then means which books are available for me to teach in my classroom. So he was sort of one of those accidental mentors that has become incredibly important and will forever be incredibly important. And then the next step, once I have this like aha moment with this parent, right? And I mean, this is an incredibly important stakeholder that I've received this phenomenal feedback from that's really essentially responsible for changing the entire trajectory of my career and what I perceive my role to be in the classroom. So I've got that, and then the next piece is I need support at my school to now make these changes, inspired by this feedback that I've received and this newfound knowledge that I've got to dig deeper and that I've got to unpack a lot of things. And that ended up being my admin. And honest to goodness, if you wanted to put together a dream team, my admin was it. And they're going to be broken up next September because one of them is moving on to another school. But Michelle Kane, my principal, Corey MacArthur, my vice principal, and Deanna Heron, the other vice principal, were incredibly important. And I came down to them and I was like, listen, here's this feedback that I've got. I'm reflecting on my practice and I need to make changes and I need your support to make those changes. I need to take some risks. I don't know what's going to work. I don't know what's not going to work. But I would like to know that you've got my back and that you're okay with me trying something new. And not only were they entirely supportive of that, but on the last day of school before summer a couple of years ago, Corey MacArthur looked at me and the very last words he said to me were, have a great summer, plan creatively. And to this day, I just think, imagine how phenomenal it would be if that was the advice that every administrator gave to every teacher, right? Because that, for me anyway, was so powerful.
Was there in that, did you feel that there was an element of permission being given that not necessarily, let's say, from a system leader, but it was sort of like, it was a moment of reminder that you need to give yourself permission? What was that sort of like, because those are just words, it can be just words. So how is it that moment of saying that, you know, plan creatively, or any of these other individuals that kind of like, they grabbed on, they said, let's go through, how did you get over your own, I guess sometimes I'll call it, let's say, nervousness or fear of change, because the reality then is when you're away from these mentors, it's you.
Right.
So how did you process through that moment of, okay, I recognize that I'm craving something here, so-and-so has said, go for it, now what?
That sort of like permission slip,
Yeah.
for lack of a better word, was fundamental. And I think that as teachers, there's safety in sameness, right? So especially as, you know, a newer person coming into the profession, or maybe as a newer teacher coming into a certain department, you walk in and there's sort of a set way of doing things, the way that things have always been done, and you know, they work, right? Those things are good, but I think that for me, there's an element of creativity that I bring to my practice. There's my background experience with Alt-Ed and really trying to understand student success, my work with the re-engagement team with the board, that makes me sort of look at things through a different lens and want to try something different. And I think that sometimes when you want to try something different, the perception is that what you're saying then is that what's being done isn't good. And that's not the case at all, right? What every teacher does in their classroom is so personal, right? And I can't replicate what you're doing in your classroom, and you can't replicate what I'm doing in mine, even if we were teaching the exact same thing. And so having that permission slip, that license to take some risks was necessary, because that's exactly what you're doing when you decide that you're going to sort of divert a little bit from the status quo, and was very important.
Was it then easy?
No.
Because I'll say every once in a while I like to have these moments during, you know, it's a nice day, we're in comfortable seats, we're sort of talking, it's lived experience,
Right.
but it takes on it can be a little bit of a bubble.
Right.
So, you know, you have everything, wheels on the ground now, the permission to go, you're activated. So your next step, can you remember what the actual, you know, or what was in that next step mode? Because someone listening is like, I'm there, I'm so there, I have all these things.
Right.
And then do I reach out to somebody else? Do I start putting down to paper? So, you know, what was your thing to start mapping out this future version of what you were, you know, hoping to create?
So in my mind, I had a sense of what I wanted to do. Like I didn't know all the details, but the big picture for me was a collaboration, an opportunity for a partnership. And just based on where I was in my own professional and personal growth, that led me to reaching out on a Facebook group for Ontario teachers, to any teacher teaching English on a First Nations reserve in Ontario. And I had this crazy, wonderful woman named Lana Kim, who was awesome and insane enough to respond to my post. And her message to me was, hey, like, I teach on a reserve, you know, what do you want to do? What are you thinking? And my response to her was, I don't know. I just know that I have this sort of big picture idea for a collaboration, and I'm curious to know if you'd be willing to do it. And her response was, okay. And then so began the first summer of planning what would eventually become YFR.
So then that's what I was going to go to next. So if you're cool with just walking through this step by step, because this becomes, in planning for change, one of the things I've observed is that there's an element of ambiguity comfort that you have to have. You get in this space, again, I've mentioned words like without gravity and sort of untethered. Sometimes it feels a little more negative sounding than it should, but there's a moment where not necessarily knowing what the next step is the exact moment you need to have, because that's opportunity for change. So you connect with Alana, You're now connected on Facebook. You've now been given permission. You're starting to think creatively, and you're going to start to draw together old stuff, new stuff, weird stuff in between, right? And you get that all as sort of like the tabletop. As you approach September, was this idea gelling yet?
Yes, but then came all of the other really important stuff. Like, how are we grounding this in the curriculum expectations, right? And so began, for me professionally, an incredibly valuable learning experience where I really started to embrace this idea that it's important that we teach skills, not content, right? So there was that, and so fortunately that resulted in me being able to reach out with Sanji, who's our English curriculum consultant, who was phenomenal from the start and was so willing and able to support this project and this collaboration. And then became like the technical aspect. So how are we actually going to connect? So that's when I harassed you. And was basically looking for the best tool to use, because the truth is that, you know, a couple of years ago, I was not technologically savvy at all. I didn't have Twitter. You know, that's also thanks to you. I was not really active on social media, and I didn't know the first thing about connecting digitally with other classrooms, how we would do that. So, you know, reaching out to you, reaching out to Joanna Bull, or DLRT, was phenomenal, and it's through you guys that I was able to connect with other people who were able to help support and give us the tools that we needed to make the project work.
I like big parts of what you're saying here, because that idea of comfort zones with tech in the classroom, I don't know if the discussion starts with what sort of relationship do I want to build.
Right.
I think we get caught, my personal opinion, we're still caught up in digital citizenship as a list of do-nots, and something concrete like that is pretty easy to follow. But with those types of street signs, the inquiry and the creativity sometimes, like, there's a cost.
Right.
When you're constantly, you can't do a certain thing. I'm not disputing it. There are definitely safety measures that need to be included in that discussion.
Right.
But I just haven't been in a really good discussion that then extends it into what sort of relationships. What's the digital world that I want to help contribute and make? So I think you sort of dropping that cold call onto Facebook is the thing that people do when they're in need now. It's back in the day, it would have been a bulletin board.
Right.
You know, I can remember how you know, they don't even have them anymore, but do you remember going into grocery stores and there'd be the bulletin board, the community bulletin board, and people just put up their own little index cards. I need someone to mow my lawn.
Right.
Looking for a babysitter. I sell cake. Like these things.
Right.
But also the looking to start a reading club. Have you been abused? Like, there was so much there that wasn't just packaged.
Right.
It was actually people taking the time to create that community. And I'm looking forward into next versions of projects like yours, but also the discussions that they start beside it about intentional relationship building.
Right.
And recognizing that the digital citizenship, the reciprocity of that, how do those two things work together? And we don't just have to talk about cybersecurity. We can talk about spirituality, culture, love, engagement in the same classroom discussion. So the actual YFR, so Youth for Reconciliation, website, Instagram presence, classroom presence, dual classroom presence, board presence,
Triple classroom presence.
Triple. What's the third one?
So we partnered with Bill Hogar Secondary School.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that now being a thing, I don't even know how to tease it apart.
Right.
I have to be honest. There's so many different elements. Here's what let's start with the digital element of it. So one of the fascinating things that I noticed is that you have a non-board website to hang the information on, and that you also were using an Instagram account.
Right.
And Instagram is not accessible inside our domain.
Right.
It's considered to be that red tool.
Right.
So tell me a little bit about using sort of, let's say, the non-board tools, though the board knew.
Right.
The board knows.
Right.
Tell me a little bit about that process. How'd you land on that? Because we're a GAPS board.
Right.
There's similar tools there, but there's walls too.
Right. So when the project began in the first semester, we were using Flipgrid,
Okay.
right? Which was a phenomenal tool and provided a really cool opportunity for collaboration between the classes that we were collaborating then. But at the end of that semester, when we had an opportunity to reflect on the project a little bit, we felt like there was something more that we wanted to explore. And at the same time, Deanna Heron, one of my vice principals, sends to me a copy of Jennifer Casa-Todd's book called Social Media.
Yeah.
And so I'm reading this book and I'm like, wow, this is super cool. And it is a book that basically talks about the importance of teaching social media use for our students, right? And it's fascinating because we live in an age where social media really permeates almost every aspect of our lives, right? It's an incredible professional tool, it's an incredible business tool, and yet it's something that as teachers in the educational system we have typically been a little bit afraid of. Or when we've been working around social media, it's been to talk about all the dark, bad things that exist with it, right? But Jennifer Casa-Todd's book really sort of inspired this idea that we should be using it, that it's an incredible tool, and that it provides really interesting opportunities. And so we just landed on using Instagram as the account because that's what the students sort of felt would be the best tool to use. And like you said, it's a red tool. It's blocked on our board Wi-Fi, but my administrative team was awesome. I talked to them about why I wanted to use it, what the goal was going to be. We created the permission forms that would need to go home, and I think, from the get-go, what's really important is just to be really transparent, right? So parents understood what the project was. They were invited to participate in the project. I had parents participating when we were using Flipgrid. So those, it carried over well.
It's cool because I think to allow, and Jay Casa-Todd may acknowledge this as well, is that when the system decides the tools that are going to inspire the kids, sometimes misses the mark.
Right.
I'll put it this way, maybe potentially has the higher potential to miss the mark.
Right.
I've been in a couple really interesting conversations about the use of digital tools where maybe we're in the transition here. There's no longer the assumption that something can't be an ed tech tool. Even more interesting is that when I was in that one, have you heard of Audrey Waters?
No.
Really cool. Someone really cool to follow, but deep in her sort of educational, I don't know, not criticism, but like constructive criticism. And in the discussion about ed tech, she also included, well, photocopiers are ed tech too.
Right.
And I thought to myself, well, I've never been in a discussion about photocopiers and assessment.
Right.
But really, when we look at the tools that are constantly around us, there's a book called The Third Teacher, phenomenal book, and it talks about the people in the room, the actual curriculum, and the room itself as being all integrated into the conversation. I think social media is somehow part of each one of those three spaces, right? It allows that whatever's happening in the room to connect with someone else's room with someone else's room.
Right.
So I'm fascinated by the discussion around whether or not social media is now a layer or it's actually a starting point. It's no longer something that's just put on top of a classroom. Because I would argue that if we're putting the things just on top of the classroom that we as teachers assume the kids are going to connect with, maybe, maybe not.
Right.
And you get in that interesting comfort space too, like, oh great, now I got to learn another tool to sort of help the students out.
Right.
As I observed some of the postings that you had over the course of the year, I started to wonder about, like I asked you about when you kind of noticed your teacher side. At what point with this project, did it have enough stuff happening into it that it became fragile? And I only mean that as sometimes on the on-ramp in the planning, we feel fragile in that sort of creative, oh, will it work? Who do I have to connect with? But I think for myself, one of the true moments of fragility in something becomes once it's in motion.
Right.
And you're in that sort of keeping all the pieces, all the plates in the air.
Mm-hmm.
At what point did you observe or think to yourself, wow, now the work really has to begin? Because with the Flipgrid, just because you mentioned that quickly,
Mm-hmm.
it was connection around a book.
Right.
So once it was no longer necessarily about the book or the lesson,
Mm-hmm.
what was the next life that kind of came out of it? Like what took it through to the rest of the semester?
So, well, and that's exactly why YFR turned into what it was, because it didn't turn into anything beyond a really cool way to do a novel study when we were using Flipgrid. And, through that connection, the students learned so much about each other, but then it was done.
Mm-hmm.
And so at the end, we really reflected on the fact that it didn't feel like the students had any agency beyond that initial connection, sharing some really cool insights about the text we were reading, but then there was no so what, right? And so as I really started to explore, the 6 C's, for example, and this idea of global citizenship and that sort of thing, it became apparent that moving into semester 2, the project had to be bigger. And when I say bigger, I mean that it had to be an opportunity where the students had that sense of agency that was missing from semester 1, and that we wanted to do it in such a way that it was made public, because Flipgrid wasn't public.
Mm-hmm.
And by putting it on Instagram, it makes everything that the students are doing very accessible to anybody, right? And so we had parents that were part of our journey together, complete strangers, lots of people inside and outside our school within our board. And so when you talk about this idea of fragility, I think maybe the fragility came from the fact that because it was such a public forum and in such a public space, there's a really heightened sense of vulnerability, right, on the part of the students that are involved in the project.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had to, find ways to move around that. And then also on the part of the teachers that were involved. And for myself and Lana, being the lead teachers that created this, it was sort of a difficult space to exist in, because you have a lot of eyes on you, right? And you have a lot of opinions and a lot of feedback. And from some people, that's not always positive. And from others, it was phenomenal. And so it was sort of navigating all of those differing ideas about the value of what we were doing, the success of what we were doing, or the perceived success of what we were doing, and just trying to sort of work our way around that.
So you kind of touched lightly on as this broadened out to the community. Mm-hmm. So I think there's an interesting transition point in lesson planning in general, as in if you're planning just for the people in the room,
right?
That's a teaching 101 kind of a tool, right? You think about working to who's sitting in front of you. Mm-hmm. I think back in the day it was less about teaching to the other that's not in front of you, but we're in a different space now. Right. Maybe social media has brought us there, but Global Competencies has started that discussion about whatever we're doing with, the 30 kids and ourselves. Mm-hmm. You need to consider what's happening in the broader context, and are we communicating?
Right.
Are we sharing?
Right.
Are we connecting, and are we building? Mm-hmm. And I love that. I love that idea of, as you build capacity for your classroom and thinking a little bit bigger than classroom, hallway, school, community, global community. When it started to get bigger than the class, and you kind of started bigger than the class, let's bear in mind the lesson started bigger than your classroom. But at what point, when you started to expand out, you started to realize, okay, I need to bring I need to bring somebody else on board here to help make some of those connections or to grease the wheels. Was there anyone that came in at that point that maybe was it was a key in a lock at that point?
So when YFR turned into YFR in semester 2, I was really fortunate because 3 integral people came on board within my school. So 2 of those people were other teachers in my English department, Jessie Keys Renault and Joyce and Lynetta. And so essentially what ended up happening was that every section of 11U English at our school in semester 2, so that was 180 students approximately in total, were now involved in this project. And then our head of art, Georgia Roselle, came on board, and it was, how can we turn this cross-curricular? And then Mike Byam, who is one of the tech teachers at our school, who then sort of got involved also and had his comp tech students work with us, and they ended up being the ones that created the phenomenal video to sort of showcase or highlight what YFR did. So it was through their collaboration that YFR really turned into what it was. And then, of course, consistently and ongoing, the board's FNMI team. So like Pam and Andrew McConnell and Jody Johnson, who helped to keep everything grounded, because this second semester project, though bigger at its core, still worked with a text, and it was written by an Indigenous author, so it was navigating all of the things that came with that. And then Bob Goosey at Bill Hogarth Secondary School, who's the head of English there, and ended up providing incredible mentorship and support, just in sort of seeing the bigger picture and helping to stay the course with the project.
You had mentioned, we had mentioned 3 different classrooms. One of the classrooms is not in our school.
Right.
So before we get into sort of any like that technicality, let's say, of the actual, the lesson that led you there, or the idea that led you there, I've started to think a lot about how someone passed a quote. It was one of the Twitter post-its, an affirmation, but it talks about childhood as a series of revealed secrets. And I haven't been able to really get that out of my head, and the kind of the power of that, because I take it from a very positive standpoint, as in, as you have these experiences, you have this simultaneous kind of response of, I'm interested in this, I'm fascinated by this, it makes me a little bit afraid, but I'm also really proud of myself, and and I realize something is kind of like bringing it to me. There's an other that's allowing me to sort of notice this. I'm making it overly complicated, but the saying in itself is the revealed secrets. It makes me think about your experience and your students' experience and the other classroom students' experience, as far as when you look at it now, do you have a sense of the secrets that you're welcomed into seeing? Like what you were sort of invited to notice in these other classrooms that, when we talk about doing these, Skype visits or the mystery hangouts, and it's you ask 3 or 4 or 5 questions and try and guess where that classroom is. It strikes me like your project, there was a deeper richness to it, because it wasn't just about tourism, it was about becoming and connection and immersion.
Right.
So does anything pop up as like you're like, wow, like this is really cool that I've been invited into this space?
So I think that what was so unique about our particular partnership was that it didn't feel just like we were connecting with another classroom, but it really felt like we were connecting with another community. And I think that was probably amplified by the fact that this was a First Nations reserve. And so, Youth for Reconciliation, the name is literally in the title, this idea that we're at a point in Canada's history where we're really starting to hopefully come to terms with the past, right? And to recognize it and to own it, and then to try to move forward in a good way. And so connecting with Pikangikum, like I said, it wasn't just connecting with another classroom, it was connecting with another community and being able to see different perspectives, different rich perspectives of people who were 1,400 kilometers away from us, that felt really, really far away from us, but were still within the same province. And to get glimpses into some of the social issues that affect them or impact them. And to learn about those things in a way that felt very personal, because you can read about the water issues on First Nations reserves in the newspaper, but when you get to speak to the people directly, when you get to hear from them how that impacts them, that makes it much more meaningful. And then on the flip side of that, a lot of what we see in the media with regards to First Nations peoples tends to be pretty negative, right? And it only focuses on the social issues. But collaborating with Pakanjikum gave us an opportunity to really see the many wonderful things, right? So one of the exercises that we did at the beginning of this project was we had each of our classrooms Google one another's communities and to see what sorts of stories were available, what sorts of information were available. And the very first hit that we got when we were Googling Pakanjikum from Markham was Pakanjikum, Canada's suicide capital, or the suicide capital of the world. And then when you sort of juxtapose that with the incredible stories of these individuals living there and the beauty that they see within their community, that's when you really get to see the realness, right? The authentic point of view that you wouldn't have been able to receive otherwise.
That really is mind-blowing. I've done a similar task, but with reduced, just by clocking into Google somewhere in Europe, somewhere in Asia,
Right.
You change the extension and you do the same search and you see how differently it was all about product placement, how it's perceived, and you sort of do the deconstruction as far as the visual tools, same product but described from two different countries' perspective.
Right.
So this is a product that I've done.
Right.
What was the reaction from the students? This is not us. This is like that whole, because it really does, my gosh, it creates a real, like a sudden reaction, I would imagine, that what we're being told is not the truth.
Right. Well, and what an incredible learning opportunity for students, right?
Yeah.
And to see firsthand how the media can manipulate the way that we view things, or maybe manipulate's too strong of a word, but how they maybe can, it's all about perception, right? And that the media has such power to shine a light on different issues or different locations in a certain light. And so what made the use of Instagram so phenomenal was that the students really had this sense of empowerment, that the students in both communities had an opportunity to share who they were, who their communities are, the way they wanted to be seen, in the way that they felt was the most authentic, and to do so in a public forum so that everyone could see that.
It's cool. It makes me think, because one of the original so Twitter, one of the original kind of frames that popularized it was the ability for someone to microblog from a space that might have been impenetrable before.
Mm-hmm.
Now, pending data, and Wi-Fi and domain issues, because there's some places that Twitter would have never made it out of because the actual country is a domain. But that was one of the sort of I don't know, I guess I want to say selling points, but not, I'm using the wrong term, but that idea that you could actually connect directly to a source as opposed to waiting for the popularized story to make it out. And there's still, to this day, there's a lot of, if you can get connected with individuals on the ground with the experience, you're going to get the mainline feed. It reminds me a lot of, was it 3 years ago? 3 years ago? 3 years ago when we had the ice storm over Christmas time. Was it 3 or 4 years ago?
Roughly, yeah.
It was a pretty intense one.
Four-ish, I think.
I know, we're going back a little ways.
Yeah.
And that was when I first started using Twitter. And one of the first things I used it for, the power was out at my parents' house. And my parents, my mom was a caregiver for my father who was ailing, and her own mother who was ailing as well in the same house. And through using Twitter, neither one of them were using Twitter. Their phone wasn't working as well. But through Twitter, I was able to get to the base of their street.
Okay.
To find out whether or not the lights were on, what the power was happening, what the weather conditions were. And I tell you, like, that was really valuable to me to be able to get the true story there, because there was a whole lot of spin that was coming through the media.
Right.
So I can appreciate the necessity to use tools within education that education still hasn't fully embraced yet.
Right.
I think it creates a necessary discussion with education around authenticity, about connectivity and relationships, because there is a lot of what we do that protects the 30 kids in front of us in that classroom. And I think the reciprocal of that is that it also silos us.
Right.
We don't have as many conversations. Well, we're having conversations, but it definitely wasn't a part of my training at faculty about this idea of the 30 kids in front of you are only part of your classroom.
Right.
So I love that idea of using Insta because it right away questions, are we using the right tools?
Right.
Maybe it doesn't even question it. It just kind of goes, spits in the eye and says, we're going to use this other tool.
Right.
And you did. I would argue it was the right tool to use for this context. Absolutely.
For sure. And I think that the other piece too is that I know for myself from the beginning, looking at what sort of digital tools I could use, what would be best, there was a sense of anxiety that came along with that because I didn't consider myself technologically savvy at all. And one of the best learning experiences from this has been that as teachers, I think it's so important to learn along with our students, and our our students make phenomenal teachers, right? So they largely are the ones that help me navigate these new tools that we were learning together. And I think that it's also a really enriching experience for students to see you learning along with them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. If you're to go back to your first year of teaching, I'm going to guess there's things that you do now that were radically different. Maybe there's things that are radically the same. You're sort of holding on to it. From you coming out of faculty, what might be surprising about what you're doing with your teaching right now? So that a little bit of the then looking forward to now, the stark difference. Because we had talked a little bit in the on-ramp about how the work that we're doing, the work that you're doing, and how that should be kind of communicated to faculty. So they kind of get a flavor of what classrooms are like at ground level.
Right.
But if you even take it back to you coming out of faculty, did you have a sense of this type of purpose in your teaching?
No. And I think that coming out of faculty, the sense that I got was that I am the holder of knowledge, right? And that there were certain texts that were just assumed to have value and that were, of course, going to be taught in the classes that we were teaching. And, looking at that, where I was coming out of faculty to now, I think the biggest difference has been just understanding my role, right? Or sort of reframing what my role is. That for sure I hope I have a lot of knowledge that I can share with my students. And I do that, but that our roles changed a little bit, that the way that we deliver has changed a little bit, that our students have a lot to offer, and that it's through more enriching experiences, I think, that we can get the most authentic and valuable learning.
I think back to, it was maybe about 5-6 years ago, the school that I was at started offering, and the course might have changed names, but it was the Native Studies course. And at the time, the board was enforcing it. So the board was saying, as far as my understanding, could be a flawed memory, but my understanding of it is that it was gonna be offered no matter what.
Right.
And there was funding behind it. There was a push to sort of have that included. There was an understanding that this was a forward-looking direction that was going to start the conversation at the school level. And I can remember there was some pushback at the time, as in, because there were other people, and I'm tagging off of you, I have knowledge, and I like how you said it, I have knowledge to share, and in my mind, I was going to push through and say, but I don't own it. It's not my knowledge, I have knowledge to share. And I can remember at the time thinking to myself, this feels like they're forcing it through, and to some degree, the number of students that participated kind of supported that. Like there wasn't a lot of students that took the course. Yet, the base understandings that were a part of this discussion were so necessary. Like it was a seed moment. I just don't know if it was planted well at the time.
Right.
So I start to think about this kind of like curriculum. I want to say versus, but it's not. Let's say curriculum and experience, and how the moments in class that escape the curriculum, they're really difficult to bring back to curriculum. For me, from my experience, they're difficult to bring back to curriculum because part of what I love to see is the engagement and connection. And I think back to teaching hospitality and when the students were in the flow, and I would walk up beside them and I would actually start to micro teach a lesson, and right away I could just feel like just it's not the joy, but it's that ethereal energy that the kids were just immersed in activity and they didn't need you.
Right.
But I'm going to stop.
Right.
So what I started to do is when I walked around, I would just put Post-it notes.
That's cool.
It was until I realized that the Post-it notes stopped at 2.
Oh, right.
So what I would do instead is I would, on my own plan, I would have it mapped out on my desk. I would put the Post-it notes. So I'd still walk around and I'd data capture. I'd put the Post-it notes on the mapped out of the kitchen. And then when there was lulls in the activity, if you'd like to see some of my thoughts that I had as I walked around and I tasted your food, or I sort of just moved something over because it was going to fall in the sink, you're welcome to go see the Post-it notes. And then I would take a snap of that and post it to the classroom website.
Right.
So there are no names, but each kid, according to the lab, would know where they were. So finding that balance of allowing the students to move through the experience and not come down with the framework strikes me as the 2.0 of learning goals and success criteria, where you completely move back entirely. And for some instructors, I imagine, there's some courses where you got to be a little bit more hands-on. Obviously, if a kid was about to take a knife and peel an apple by poking I'm like, whoa, whoa, whoa. And I would draw attention to that. I'm going to break flow because you're going to lose a finger.
Right.
But I became more discriminatory in those moments. And this experience that you created for the kids in your school and the kids in the other school, as it sort of echoed out, and the students in the other school 1,400 kilometers away from you, I would struggle with that sort of like the value of the experience weighed against making curricular connections.
So I think this is where being an English teacher, though, is like extra special.
Okay.
Because that wasn't at all a conflict for me. And what I think is so special about the English curriculum is that you could do almost anything and it can relate back to it. Like it's so broad and it's so rich that connecting those experiences with curriculum from an English curriculum standpoint was super easy. The conflict for me really arose between this conflict that seems to now exist between skills and content. And I think that especially within English as a department, or as a subject area, I should say, that there's this perceived idea that there are some texts and some authors that must be taught, that the content is so important, and that we maybe are sacrificing the development of skills in order to do that. And so tying in the skills with the experience, with the curriculum, like that all just so went well together. And it's interesting that you talk about that Native Studies course because, there's value, obviously, in those courses, right? But one of the criticisms that I received about this project was that essentially this project began as a novel study. It was sort of a modernized take on a novel study. And the thing that connected the two communities together was our reading of Indian Horse, written by Richard Wagamese. And one of the criticisms that I received from a teacher was, you know what, Alicia, if you want to teach an Indigenous text, shouldn't you maybe just teach an Indigenous course? And that's where this conflict between skills and content comes in, because within the English curriculum, you could choose any text to teach those skills, right? It doesn't have to be The Catcher in the Rye. It doesn't have to be Romeo and Juliet. It could be literally anything. And the idea that we should have separate courses, or that it's only in separate courses that we can teach these diverse texts, to me is really concerning. And so, I mean, that it's sort of a slippery slope, right? If that's the attitude, then should we have now a separate course for LGBTQ plus authors? Do we have a separate course for African Canadian authors, right? Like, it's very twisted. And so that's where the conflict really arose for me, and that's where differing opinions really started to bubble up, and where there was questioning about what was being used as the core for the project.
It again kind of comes back to that ambiguity comfort, and what is yours versus yours and the students and the school and the system and the community that's around there. The conversation I was in around this is that in some ways I think that our steps towards our modern learning framework, having math, mental health, modern learning, having our understanding of these pillars,
and now equity
in there as well, the grind to understand what those pillars mean for our board was just the beginning. What does it now mean for the board if we are actively overlaying those pillars together? So paying attention to equity in mathematics, looking at mental wellness at the same time that we're using our digital stuff. And it strikes me that's the new place, the synthesis, that's the new place to exist in. We touched quickly talking about modern learning and including culture and spirituality in a public school system. Like that's a real 2.0 way to think about our classrooms, because it really does decenter what we assume a classroom should be. And for some individuals that can be kind of uncomfortable, but I think it's in that discomfort that cool conversations like this come out. And when you say, do we have texts that are so specific in the pursuit of revealing truth,
right,
that just could be moving into another silo, right? So I wouldn't make it an argument, but it's definitely there's I wouldn't go looking for a fight on that one, but I think I would find myself in one,
right,
because I think that in some ways the overlap of courses is what makes the experience of school sticky. I saw on Twitter someone posting, what do you want your students to remember 5 years from now? And I kind of put back, I said, I've seen this question pop up a lot in PD sessions, but I would rather just be neutral in that and not necessarily have them to be able to name me.
right.
I don't want, because that's what some of the, and I only said that because a lot of the posts were sort of talking about the forgetting of what happens in the now. I said what I would rather have is that right now they know my name, they know their fellow students' name, they know their community's name. Right now they're connecting. Right now they're sharing and activating. To have an assumption that 5 years from now that I should have a tether on that, and I get it, we're helping kids with their pathways all the time, but I can't go to the ego to assume that they will remember anything. I want them to be able to go and do.
Right.
And I think that's an interesting space in education right now, that we're actually doing so much in the now, and what's in the now is kind of messy in some ways.
Yeah, in a nice way, in a cool way.
It's the
right?
nice mess.
Yeah.
What does it say? What was the getting into the good trouble?
Right.
I think that's been posted more about our American colleagues getting in protests and stuff, but that's what it is, getting in the good trouble.
Right.
We're kind of at the tail end, but I gotta ask you one more if you got time. Yeah?
Yeah.
So I want to talk about the next. I want to move into, we're in the summer break. Thanks again for hanging with me. So moving into the next. The YFR as a semester-long experience is now, you had mentioned before, potentially it's sort of in other people's hands to a degree. You now have this lived experience of moving through a project that shifted between classroom and experience and other classrooms and other people's experiences. Moving into September, what is it that you're building? Moving into September, what are you taking with? What are you leaving behind? What is it that you're not sure of moving into September?
So as we move into September, the plan is that YFR continues and that it continues to grow. We have a couple of new partnerships that are being built that will begin in September. And so that just means more opportunities for collaboration. And, in terms of like, what am I unsure about? I think the really special thing about this type of project is that it's very organic, right? And it kind of grows based on who's involved and based on the interests of the students. So I couldn't even begin to tell you what it will look like by the time maybe we have the same conversation next summer after a year, because it really will depend on just what unfolds, basically. But the plan is that it will continue, that the learning will continue, that the opportunities for collaboration will continue. There'll be even more people involved, and you'll have a chance to check it out on the Instagram page. We're going to continue with that also.
That's cool. That's very cool. So to wrap it up, is a question that I've asked a few. I like the way the question kind of allows you to freestyle just a little bit, if you will. Part of the initial, I've let go of a lot of how my podcast was in the beginning. Like, I've learned a lot about what I thought I was going to do and what I should and shouldn't do with the podcast. But one of the things that was always kind of at the heart of Chasing Squirrels was the idea of pursuing change, and how sometimes when we achieve it, do you know the story? No? Do you want me to tell it to you just quick?
Yeah, please.
So back in the day, my dog caught a squirrel off a tree.
Okay.
Literally grabbed it off the tree. And, you know, when I've related that story to other people, they're like, oh yeah, I totally, like, I've tried to sort of like if you approach a squirrel in a tree, you counter spiral each other. It always seems like they're just out of reach.
Right.
Somehow my dog pulled one off. And what was it wasn't interesting at the time. It was very stressful. But my dog didn't know what to do. So the squirrel, it was like nose boxing. The squirrel's on the ground making squirrel noises, and my dog is sort of like bouncing her nose off it, and nothing really happened apart from a lot of confusion.
Okay.
And then the squirrel got away and kind of disappeared, and all of a sudden was like a few branches up, and then my dog's like, what just happened?
Right.
And that was only a story. It was just an experience from my life. But when I started to think about how change happens to us, how we activate in it, like it started to feel like, okay, there's something to this analogy that, you know, no matter what we do, sometimes we're surprised when we get it.
Right.
When we actually have it in our hands, it can be pretty confusing, and then all of a sudden it's like the moment's gone.
Right.
So within that idea of sort of chasing change or being challenged by change, who are you in that frame? Are you a person that sort of like can really drive at change, and you're like, yeah, I want to sort of create this next thing? Are you sort of like are you the instigator and kind of like other people to do it? Are you sort of slow to get the change and then you're just gung-ho? So what's your sort of like, someone said, so Clough, you asking me, am I the squirrel or the dog?
Right.
I don't know. I was like, I don't know. Are you the tree? Like, what's that?
Oh, wow.
How do you deal with change?
So I embrace it. So
Okay.
to keep with this, like, I guess, theme of squirrels, I have, in all dead, one of my former colleagues used to talk about shiny squirrel syndrome.
Oh, I love this.
And
I already like this.
I have shiny squirrel syndrome. So I see something and I'm like, oh, that captures my attention immediately.
Yeah.
And then I kind of just want to run after it and see where it takes me. And so it's funny because I think that in our profession, we've all heard the term drinking the Kool-Aid.
Yeah.
Right? And there are a lot of negative connotations that come with that. Like, oh yeah, he's really drinking the Kool-Aid, right? Like, he's really bought into whatever. And I see it the exact opposite. I'm all about the Kool-Aid because there's so many different flavors of Kool-Aid and it all tastes awesome. And
Can I pause you? Do you remember Freshie?
no.
You don't remember Freshie?
No.
Freshie was sort of like the beta to the VHS.
Okay.
Like, you know, it never really went out. But yeah,
Did you just age yourself a little bit?
I totally did.
Sorry.
But Freshie's mascot was like, I think like a toucan or something.
Okay.
But it was funny. Like, I never got Kool-Aid.
Okay.
I think Freshie was maybe a little less expensive. So my mom only bought Tang and Freshie. Yeah, but that's a back in the day. Sorry, I totally jumped in.
That's
You made me
so
think
funny.
of like alternative drinks. I'm like, I'm about the Freshie.
So I really like the Kool-Aid, and I think that the different flavors of Kool-Aid all serve our students. And in terms of like who am I with regards to change, I love it.
Yeah.
One of the best compliments that I ever received was from a former principal of mine who's since retired. Her name is Beverly Madigan. And
Yeah, I know Bev. Yeah.
one of the
Yeah, I've
best
met.
compliments that she gave me was, you know, Alicia, you've never been afraid to do what you felt was in the best interest of your students. And so I look at the students that are in front of me in my classroom every day, and I have a diverse group of kids. And we talked about all of those experiences and unique backgrounds, right, that each of those kids bring to our classroom every day. And I'm just forever in the search of how I can, oh God, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, leverage that with the skills that we need to teach and the curriculum that we need to cover. And so I just find that every new thing that rolls out, at least in my experience, and I'm only like 8-ish years in, so maybe I haven't been around for any crazy things yet, but all of the things that seem to roll out just seem to further support what we need to do in our classrooms and further support our kids. So I'm all for change.
I love it. I want that on a t-shirt. I get stickers made. I'm all about the Kool-Aid.
Yeah, all about the Kool-Aid.
All about the Kool-Aid. I'd say I'm all about the freshie. All right, Alicia, thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me. And
awesome.
Sincerely, Chris, thank you for, I sort of made reference to it, but a couple of years ago you did this phenomenal PD workshop for teachers, and that's where sort of the seeds, like I mentioned, were planted a little bit. And so, like, you know, those workshops, this podcast, the support that you offer on Twitter, for example, I appreciate that, and I'm sure that I'm not the only teacher that does. So thanks for what you do.
Thanks, and I am going to check in a year from now.
Okay.
Because you threw that down. I wasn't going to sort of book, and I don't book a year. I'm not about to sort of put it into my phone right now. There's no way.
Okay.
But yeah, I can't wait. I can't wait to sort of like play with the next story, for sure.
Fun.
Cool. High five. Thanks talking.
You too.
Thanks for checking out this episode of Chasing Squirrels podcast with Alicia Pascual. The music in the episode comes to you by Creative Commons licensing. The song on the front end, Ukrainian Rhythm, and the song on the tail end, Tizani, both are by the artist 4BS TR, 4CK3R. Neither of the songs have been changed in any way, or tweaked, or modified. Once again, thanks for checking out the podcast.